All right, we should be okay now.
Yes, sir.
We finished with chapter 7, verse 3 last week, and I rendered it this way, that the husband rendered the wife the things being due to her, and I added the eunoia. I translated it with a favorable mind. And likewise, also the wife, let the wife render to the husband the things due to him with a favorable mind. And you see part of it's in italics. In this context, due benevolence or her due is in the conjugal relations area, I believe. Okay. Any questions? All right, let's look at next verse. And Jerry, can you do that one for us?
Yep, I think so. Hey, gune, tu, idiu, somatos, uk, eskusanze, all, o, ho, oner, ho, moi, os, de, kai, ho, oner, tu, idiu, somatos, uk, eskusanze, that's not right. All a gune. And I put the wife does not have authority over her, I added her, own body, but I added instead the husband. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his, added his, own body, but instead the wife.
Right, that's not power or authority. It could be either power or authority. So the wife has not power, and this is obviously talking about the conjugal relations. The word but is all, short for Allah, and that contrasts two things that are in different categories. So the husband and wife are in different categories. One's a man, one's a woman. See, the woman does not, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not, but the wife does. All right? He's obligated to render the due benevolence. Let's go back and look at it now. He's just explaining what he just said. He's continuing the thought of verse 3. So we have to keep it in its context, and that helps us to see it. Right here, when we come down in Hebrews 13:4, marriage is honorable in all and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers or fornicators and adulterers God will judge. So the false doctrine taught by many religious groups that sex and marriage is unclean is destructive to the institution of marriage. It's a way to bond. It's also a way to have children, and it has several purposes, but it's certainly not sinful, right? Between a husband and wife. Any comments there? It's been taught by some religious groups that it's indeed something's wrong with marriage. There's even some that have taught that the sin of Adam and Eve was to have sexual relations and in the Garden of Eden. I don't believe that's true at all.
Okay. I think they read the account very well.
No. So, but this is really way off the beaten track. That doctrine is. So it's his own body, idios, pertaining to oneself. And our word idiom comes from this word. It's its own thing, or it's a peculiarity of that particular language. Usually it's idiom of speech. But it says the wife. The wife has power over her husband's body, and the husband has power over the wife's body.
And they're supposed to be happy about the situation.
Yes. You're supposed to be
I
happy.
mean, it's in
about
that word benevolence.
it. Yeah, that's with a good mind toward the other one. Yeah.
I think it even says
Right.
enthusiasm.
Yeah.
So it's, there's supposed to be a closeness there.
Yeah. Let's go back and look at it here. My translation, the wife doesn't have power over her own body, but the husband has power over her body, and I put has power over her body in italics. Likewise, also the husband does not have power over his own body, but the wife has power over his body in italics. Let's go back to verse 3 and pick up something that Jerry just said. We'll look at it.
Should be further up.
Eunoia is with a good mind now. So the mind is to have a good attitude toward what we're doing, okay? I realize that some of the manuscripts don't have that word in there, but I believe the best manuscripts. Is there comments? Right. Now, let's look at verse 5 and Chris, you read that for us?
Yes. Me aposterete alleleos mete on ek sum phonu pros chiron hina scholazete te nestea nestia kai te prose ku eke kai halin epi tu ato sun sethe hina me per aze umas o satanas dia tain akrasion humon. So I have a stop depriving one another, if not out of mutual agreement, for a season or a time that you may devote yourselves unto fasting and or for prayer, and again together, or upon that you may be together, that not may be kept, he may tempt you, the Satan, through the lack of self-control of you, your self-control.
Notice defraud, to rob and
Let's use deprive.
deprive is what they're doing. New American Standard translates it deprive. You notice on the screen there. And it's may with the present imperative, which means stop doing it. So they were doing it for whatever reason. They were depriving one another, or someone was depriving someone. And he says to stop that. And stop doing this. Or depriving.
In the times of arranged marriages, and a lot of times an older man had a much younger woman, a wife, there was often love wasn't there to begin with, and so that would kind of be one of those fallout problems that would have to be overcome in time.
Yeah. The commandments to a husband were agape love. He was always commanded to agape love his wife, and the wife was commanded to phileo love, and that's the affection love. She was to learn to be affectionate toward him. And as you pointed out, in the days of arranged marriages, that might be kind of necessary. You just have to learn to like the person. Right? So, but the man was to take the lead in loving his wife, doing what was good for her, that agape love.
That would make it easier for her to do what
Right.
she's supposed to do.
And I think he should take the lead. The man should be the leader in the family, not the boss. There's a difference between being a leader and a boss, if you know what I mean. Okay? All right. So one the other, except it be by what?
Mutual consent.
Symphonu. Symphonos is the term, and our word symphony comes from this. Symphony. So in the symphony, all the musicians play the instruments in harmony with the other instruments. I would translate it mutual consent rather than just consent.
That's the way he did too.
Yeah. Mutual consent.
But mutual agreement.
Mutual agreement's a good remedy. And this is even then, it's just to be for how long?
Or season, the
For
time.
a season, a limited time. Thayer says a definitely limited portion of time with the added notion of suitableness. It's kairos. Trench tells us kairoi, or the nominative plural form of this, and he's using that, refers to the gradual, perhaps unobserved ripening and maturing process that results in grand decisive events that close one period of history and inaugurate another. Examples would be the noisy end of the old Jewish dispensation. So when you study it even more, it might even be like when fruit is ripe, the season is ripe. And so this is only for a limited time that they refrain, and it's for this limited time, a suitable time.
And for a particular, for reasons. There has to be a reason for it.
And here's the reason. He gives the reason. Here's the reason. Notice on the screen here. I've underlined it here. Here is the reason they're allowed to abstain from conjugal relations in this context, to engage in prayer and fasting. I think if one party is ill, I think that's another reason. It should be obvious, right? Or maybe injured or something, right?
On here, I was questioning on it. It has the definite article for fasting and prayer, but it's hard to know but if we put it in there, would it be for the spiritual purposes?
I think fasting was a spiritual purpose in the first century.
Okay.
There's a question about whether or not we ought to fast in the 21st century. There are some in the church who think we ought to fast, and it's an individual matter that we should. And that the church shouldn't be saying we need to fast today, but there was fasting in the first century, and some did fast. I know that some people who have diabetes have trouble with that, though. I think they do. They just can't hardly go without food. They have to have food. And that's a good question about whether or not I don't teach that we ought to fast, but I do from time to time do fast.
If we did put the definite article in there, would we want to modify that a little bit? For the fasting for spiritual benefit?
The action of fasting, I think, this.
Okay.
And that makes it it points at it. And this is one particular thing, fasting in the context would be for a spiritual matter.
Okay.
I think when we get sick, we automatically fast because your body turns itself off to protect the body. Yeah. And so you're, I can't think of the name of your system. Okay. I'm sorry. Our body turns, when we get sick, it doesn't want food because it takes energy to digest the food. And so it will pull from the fat cells. And And this is your, the name of the system we have, I just can't think of it, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
But our body does that, okay? Sympathetic nervous system, what it's called.
Okay.
And fasting and prayer, those are the two things that went with it. So it's for a spiritual matter, right? Now, we know if one party has to go to the hospital or something like that for a week or two, that's pretty obvious that's going to happen, okay?
And there was a given time after you've had a baby.
Yeah.
That there was a purification period, which was really a healing period.
Yeah.
But it's called purification period.
Well, they weren't to have conjugal relations with their wives when they're bleeding.
Yeah.
And they would bleed.
So this is more like an example of a period of time.
Yeah.
How long does it take to fast and pray? Well, a day, you know. So.
Well, I'm talking about the Jews weren't. And that
I know,
probably is a good rule for us today too. Okay. But so if a woman has a baby, now what do? They give her a shot to stop the bleeding. And the woman will flow for a certain period of time after she gives birth. I think it's a bad thing that they stop the flow. I think the flow has a purpose. Cleanse and clean out the body. But I'm not a physician, but I know they give them a shot to stop it. I think it's a bad thing. I really don't think it's good. That's my opinion, because it changes something that God set in motion. I don't believe in knocking down your fever if you got a fever, because a fever will help you to fight the germs or bacteria or viruses, whatever you have. I don't stop it if I'm trying to vomit. I don't take something to stop it, and I let my system clean out what's in there that's really bad for me and get rid of it if I can. So I let the system work. That's what I do. But that's just my thinking.
Yeah. I think it's right. Many have the same questions about giving babies a lot of shots right after they're born,
Yeah.
and a lot of chemicals or even vitamins.
So when they circumcise a baby when he's born, a boy, they give him vitamin K instead of waiting until the 8th day to do it. They gave him a vitamin K shot, which I'm not sure his little body is able to, I don't think it's good for him. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. I think you're onto something there. You're right.
Yeah. And maybe together, so they are to come back together. So they're to come back together, and it's soon erchomai to come with one another or together. They're to come together again, probably the middle voice. Probably the middle voice. You remember, I don't know, when a man and a woman are to be joined together, you know that's in the middle voice.
It's a mutual decision.
Yeah. And both of them, it's a plural verb, and it's in the middle voice, joined together. Husband and wife joined together. I just would throw that in. The conjugal relations, this is not necessarily, it's a middle passive form, but I think it's middle voice, okay? Conjugal relations are to occur after the prayer and fasting, or fasting and prayer, okay? And he says, here's why you're to come together, in order that what? Satan not what?
Not
Tempt you.
tempt you.
Satanas, or Satan, is the adversary. I just don't even understand Satan. He's evil. Why would he want people to be lost? He's evil. He's an evil person, okay? And why would we want to give in to him? I don't know. I just think about it. And so, but he's, all right, he will tempt us And that he tempt you not tempt you because of your failure to what?
Your lack of self-control.
Exercise.
The lack of self-control,
Or intemperance.
incontinency, but it's a failure to control yourself, okay? It's awful primitive and having control or rule over yourself. The word's only found twice in the New Testament, and here in Matthew 23:25 is the other place. Failure to render the conjugal relations might place either one or both of the parties in a situation where they may be tempted and even sin, commit fornication. I'll give you my judgment on this. I think if a party, a husband or a wife, withhold themselves from their mate, and they could have engaged in conjugal relations, but they didn't, for whatever reason, and the mate does commit fornication against them, I sincerely doubt that they have scriptural grounds for divorce, because they're party to it. They caused it with their actions.
Certainly don't think they're an innocent.
I think you have to be innocent to have grounds for divorce. That's my conviction. I think we got two guilty parties, two people who've sinned. That's my conviction. And they just need to get back together and start doing right. Forgive each other and go on. That's what I think.
I added something in this too. I just want to make sure if it's right or not, or if I can do this. I put, except for mutual consent for a season, so that you both may be free to fast and to pray, and return back again to the same place or the same state or the same situation. Because that's sort of it's in this phrase, epito auto.
To the same state, yeah.
Into the same, and I think it'd be the same situation, what you were in before, which would be back to where you were doing the conjugal relations.
I think that's a good point, Jerry. If one see what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Get it again for me.
okay. The epito auto. If you look that up, it's an idiom phrase. It's not. You just can't look at the words. And the way it's used and interpreted is into the same place, into the self, but it was the same. And so it was back to that same condition, or back to the same things you were doing before you mutually consented to stop doing those things. And so I added, return back again to the same, I put place, but it really was situation, or
Do the same something.
yeah. And I hadn't.
In the same situation. It would probably be in italics, to the same situation. Okay. I like that. It's not translated by the translators, epito auto.
No, but if you look up the words,
Yeah,
that's
they
in the
don't
meaning.
translate it. I don't have it translated here, and I'm gonna change my translation here. And I need my hand spanked for not making that point myself. Thank you, Jerry. I've translated stop defrauding one another, if not of or out of mutual consent. If not of mutual consent, for a season, in order that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and you yourselves may come together again. That's how I translated it. In order that Satan may tempt you on account of your lack of self-control. So I've translated that you yourselves may come together again. Right? So epito auto, I translated you yourselves. But I think Jerry's point is real good. James, you got any comments on that?
Not on that. I did have a question, though. If at some point I'd like to interject. Is it okay to do that now?
Sure.
Okay. Where it says, and incidentally, Jerry did make a very good point. In order that Satan may not tempt you, Satan, like God, I would assume, has location, that he is in one place at one time. And so how many people can he tempt on a daily basis? He doesn't have God's power, so to speak. So he's rather limited in his ability to tempt. Why is he singled out? Would be
Well, I
my
think
first question.
he's tempting through his agents. That's my answer
Okay,
to
so,
it.
all right, so
And
he's,
Like
because
temple
we're also
prostitutes,
told that each one is tempted.
as Jerry said, like the temple prostitutes would be a temptation for the guys there in Corinth.
Okay, so it'd be his and his minions, of which there are tens of thousands. And how do they go about this process? Because we're told that each one is tempted when he's dragged away and enticed by his own lusts.
He is by his own lust, but what happens here is those lusts begin to be stronger because of not engaging in conjugal relations with your mate.
Right?
And so the temptation, which is all around us, when I was a college professor, I had women to come in and offer to have sex with me for a grade. It happened more than once. And I just told them, I said, I'm not into that. I'm not going to do that. I'll help you with your work. Just please don't, let's don't even talk about this again. That's how I would reply to them. But apparently there were professors that were doing it because they were surprised that I wasn't willing to. All right.
And how does one of his minions accomplish that? I mean,
Well, those gals were tools of Satan when they came to me.
and
Don't
and
you
how?
think they were?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, but I'm not understanding how they become their minions because what they're doing. In other words, to what extent is there any influence by one of the demons to accomplish that?
Well, a demon is just an evil spirit, and I think in the first century they were possessing people. But I don't think they possess people today. I think that's ceased. I think we have proof of that.
So how do they accomplish it today?
Well, I'll tell you what, they accomplish it through evil people who become Satan's tools.
It's usually lack of knowledge of God or lack of having God in their mind. And then you just naturally become evil if you refuse to have God in your knowledge. And then you become a tool. Satan works on. I don't know how he actually works and does that.
Well, God works through his word to influence us. I don't think he directly intervenes to change our mind. I think he operates through motive.
So what does Satan operate through?
I think he works pretty much the same way.
What word? I'm sorry, I'm not following.
Anything that's contrary to the scriptures is the tool of Satan.
So he gets credit for what we decide to do ourselves.
He released the error and turned it loose in the world.
Okay. All right.
He did exercise direct control over, he was allowed to exercise direct control over Job. So there may be things like that we don't know that happen. I mean, some temptation is good. You don't ever get, if you don't exercise, you don't get strong. But, you still have to learn to have self-control.
Well, you're asking some hard questions, James.
I'm struggling with it. So
I've always had a problem with the situation. I know the Bible says Satan is involved, but I know he could be involved like God is through influence. When I was studying at the university, I took some education courses, and some of my courses were philosophy of education. Well, I learned the evil that's taught in our school systems, that's taught to our teachers. And they're taught pragmatism, which basically says the end justifies the means. And I wrote a treatise on that, dealing with that. And we were taught, and the teacher, one of the professors said, there are no right answers. There's no such thing as right and wrong. He actually said that, okay? And I was smart aleck. I responded, I held my hand up, says, does that mean that you can't count our answers wrong on a test? And the whole class just laughed. But he actually said that. And there is no such thing as moral right and wrong. And we're being taught that in our school systems today. But if you believe that, then you'll just do anything.
To the extent, I think the point was made about Job, to what extent is Satan able to accomplish the same type of approach with us today?
I don't know that he is, but I don't know that he isn't. I mean,
I don't have an answer to that.
Okay. All right. Well, didn't want to distract us, but I've never been able to
No.
understand that very well.
I know, I've thought about that before too, but it just gives you a headache.
Okay. James, we'll get to you on the next verse then. You got a short.
Uh-oh. Oh, thank you. Verse 6.
Please.
All right. Yes, sir. Tuto de lego kata sun gnomen u katepi ta gain. And I translated that, now this I say according to concession and not according to command.
He is not commanding them to do what?
I think it's the next thing, not the previous thing, but I don't know.
I like the question.
Yeah, I was looking at that and I just chose to think he was referring to verse 7 instead of back to verse 5. Because if it's verse 5, it's the stopping the deal. I think that is a command. I think that's not Paul's giving it by permission. The permission part is to not marry, to stay unmarried because of certain situations. And so I think that's the one he's getting ready to introduce as by permission.
Well, the word tuto or hutos always takes its antecedent as something that went before it.
So it does? It's always before?
Antecedent, not a postcedent.
That throws my theory out.
I think I have let me see here. I can get into my other file and find that. If you'll remind me, we'll do that, but let me get to this verse. Right. I think I have the file up. But I believe that it does take an antecedent instead of a postcedent. Now, okay, the pronoun that is commandment, it will take a postcedent. So there are some that take a postcedent as follows. And the file, if you do a search on postcedent and antecedent, A-N-T-E, that's Latin for before, A-N-T-E. A-N-T-I is Greek, but A-N-T-E is Latin, antecedent and postcedent. I think this will take an antecedent, right? So what we have here, if it takes an antecedent and it's singular, it's the fasting and prayer may be abstaining from that conjugal relations. Neither the fasting nor the abstaining from conjugal relations are required. I take the position that you're not required to fast and you're not required to. You are required to pray though. But the fasting and the abstaining from conjugal relations are not commanded.
And you're not commanded to do that in order to pray, because you can
Yeah.
pray anytime.
So that's what I take it to be. Although it could go all the way back to verse 2 and refer to the permission to marry, not I speak by way of permission and not a commandment. This permission to not get married, to be a single person, okay, or to be married. I think it probably refers to the fasting and conjugal relations.
I mean, you can be faithful, but you don't have to stop that just so that you can give yourself to a whole day full of fasting and
Yeah.
prayer. But it isn't a command. That's a good idea,
Yeah.
maybe by permission, but not a command. That makes sense.
I take the position that fasting is a good idea from time to time, but that it's not commanded. And it sometimes, I think it just helps clean your body out, and it makes your mind clear a little bit. It can make your mind clear.
Yeah,
But I don't get up and preach it. Jerry, this is one of the few times you've heard me mention it, isn't it?
yeah.
And Jerry's been attending here several decades while I was here. Okay, so
I was here before you.
I came in '78. Okay. So, but I don't think, I'm not convinced that we're commanded to fast. I think it's one of those things that's, well, we're allowed to do it and it can help us. And, but I just don't think we ought to command it of people, but require it.
Well, it sounds like you're not commanded to deprive one another in order to do that
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
So that makes more sense now.
Not sure I followed the comment. So are you saying that conjugal relationships is also not of command?
The abstaining from conjugal relationships to pray and fast is not a command. Does that make sense what we're saying?
It's an exception thing. That's why he uses the word accept.
So it relates only to fasting and prayer.
Well, no, I think it's fasting and
Abstaining
from conjugal relations so that you can fast and pray. And that's one of the things that some people were doing. And he said, I'm not commanding you. I'm giving you permission to do that, but I'm not commanding you to do that. They're not commanded to fast. They are commanded to pray elsewhere. But so I don't think he's talking about the prayer. I think
But you
he's
don't
talking
have to
about
avoid
fasting. And
conjugal relationships, for
Yeah.
a period of time in order to do the prayer.
right in the middle of the screen, I have it. It's probably the word "this" may refer to fasting and prayer. Neither the fasting nor the abstaining from conjugal relations are required in the New Testament. Neither of those is required. But since it's singular, it may refer to permission to marry in verse 2. And that would go along with Paul giving advice in verses 2 through 9.
Okay, thank you. That helps. I'm clear now.
And it may just be as a partial response to stop doing something that you're doing for the wrong reason. If you're going to do it, make sure it's for the right reason. And that's by permission, but God didn't order you to do that.
And right here, the reason I don't go all the way back to verse 2 in my interpretation is because he used hutos, which is the near, whereas he would have used ekainos if he had been using the distant one rather than tuto. Okay? Ekainos. And so I think that he would have been using a different demonstrative pronoun, okay? Right? He used the immediate and rather than the distant demonstrative. It's like this and that. This and that. This is near and that's far. Okay. So he used the this rather than the that pronoun that we would equivalent to our English pronouns. I take this to, let me see here. Here it is, it's on the screen. Jerry. The Greek word hutos is a demonstrative pronoun and refers back to an antecedent, not to something that follows the postcedent.
Okay.
The reason that personal demonstrative and relative pronouns function differently than interrogative pronouns, those who ask the question, of course, is this: the former substitutes something already revealed in the context of known quantity, while the latter would be your interrogative, or anticipatory of a substantive not yet revealed, an unknown quantity. One refers back to the antecedent, the other looks forward to the postcedent. So I did have it in the notes. Okay, so I have it here. Other Greek grammarians tell us that the demonstrative takes an antecedent. They use the word anaphoric, and let me highlight it right here with the mouse. Right there, anaphoric. That's a big fancy word. And I defined that word in the file that I sent you, a Greek lexicon and grammar notes file. And I think I mentioned that file last night in class, the last class of the Greek. It's in that file. And so we ended the class last night. So anaphoric, it kind of goes before it, okay? And so so the claim that the demonstrative takes a postcedent is not the norm, okay? So the concession that Paul has given is to abstain from conjugal relations for fasting and prayer. I think that's what he's, and he gives by concession. I concede that you can do that. I've told you that you're not to withhold yourself, but I concede that you can do that for a season. Then you come back together, and you then things go back to, as Jerry said, back to the norm. I think I missed something there on that translation. I'm gonna go back and look at it. Jerry pointed out. All right. The acts of setting aside short periods of time for fasting and prayer was good, but optional. That's what I take it to be. And I think that's what he means by this word concession. I think there are things that are good, but optional in the Bible. I think the selling of all that one possessed in Acts 4, 32 to 37 was a good act, but I believe it was optional. Right?
The decision not to marry during persecution would be optional, not a command. Probably a good idea.
It was a good idea, but it was optional. Acts 5:4 shows that the selling of all that they had was optional. And Ananias and Sapphira, their problem was they lied about it. Had they not lied about it, said, well, we're giving half of it, that still would have been great. It's been okay. But they just lied. And Peter said, while it remained not remain thine own. So you had the right, and after so was it not in thy power. You had the right to sell it and to keep it. As thou hast conceived the same in thy heart, thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God. So the problem was not in not giving all of it. The problem was in lying about it. So they didn't have to give all of it. They didn't have to sell it. Okay. Any comments there? All right. According to concession, not according to commandment. Now, this right here could lead you to think, to the conviction that indeed this went all the way back to getting married. See? All right. So let's try verse 7. Back to Jerry, if we would.
Okay. Thelo, Gar, Pantas, Anthropus, Enai, Hos, Kai, Ematon, Al, Eschatos, Idion, Charisma, Eke, Ek, Theou, Hos, Min, Hutos, Os, De, Hutos, or Hutos. For, and I added, it is my will that all men to be just as also myself, but each individually has his own gift. Thus, well, this part I don't know. Thus, but the other thus. And so I didn't want to just do it the way the King James did, but it's the same word, thus, but the other thus. You have this gift, the other one has another gift, but it's the same word.
Okay. So each one has his own gift. And some people, I think some people need to be married, and some can live single.
Yeah, some people can't be alone.
Yeah. I've got a friend that I went to high school with, he's a member of the church, and his wife died about 10 years ago. And when she was dying of cancer, she told him, she says, you need to find you a good wife and marry. And he said, okay. But he told me, he said, I'm not going to. So he told me one time, about 6 months ago, he said, I'm not going to marry. And so I've talked to him on the phone, but I haven't seen him in several years. We talk on the phone from time to time, email. But so, some men will never. He probably never will remarry. So, and he doesn't need to. He can live singly. He's a Christian. He'll be okay. But maybe some men would need to. Okay. All right. Some men need to be married because of troubles, and the conjugal relations can take care of part of the problem. Okay.
In that particular time, the women certainly needed to if they could, because they might starve to death otherwise.
Yeah, they needed it. They needed a husband to take care of them because they didn't have the ability to go out and make a living, except maybe as a prostitute or something. Right? My grandfather deserted his family and left my grandmother with 3 children, and she had to work in a washing place to wash clothing. And she got tuberculosis, which is a disease that hits people because of malnutrition. It hits them when they're malnourished pretty badly. A lot of people that are malnourished will get it. So what I say, here she died in 1924. So they just women couldn't get good jobs, couldn't support a family. Paul was single, either a widower, strictly divorced, or one who'd never been married. How do I know this? Well, let's look at 1 Corinthians 9:5. It's on the screen. Have we no right to lead about a wife that is a believer? See? So right here, he says, I have a right to have a wife. So that means he's either a widower, strictly divorced, or one who's never been married. Now, that's the conclusion I draw. So he has a right to have a wife. And with his case, she's to be a believer. I don't think it's sinful to marry an unbeliever. I think it's unwise. Okay. I just don't think it's a good idea to marry an unbeliever. But I'm not convinced it's a sin. But it's not a wise thing to do. But I would say to be an officer in the church, an apostle, a prophet, evangelist, an elder, deacon, you'd have to have a wife who was a believer, who was faithful. And I think we see the qualifications. Let me point out with the a fortiori principle. What's true of the lesser is true of the what? Greater. So the qualifications of a deacon's wife in 1 Timothy 3 would be applicable to an elder if an elder is a greater work. So that's why he gives the qualifications for deacons' wives, but not elders' wives, because they'll have to have at least the same qualifications. Well, if a prophet or an apostle, and Paul and Barnabas, I believe, even I and the rest of the apostles and brethren of the Lord were probably prophets that were members of the church. They were probably prophets. So they're in a higher role even than deacons. And the deacon's wife has to be a believer. So I would argue all these other roles, they have to have believing wives. Okay? Does that make sense? That's my
If they
opinion.
have wives.
If they have wives.
Yeah.
Peter
Yes,
said he was an
thank you.
elder, so yeah.
If they have wives. And of course, the elders, deacons, they have to have wives, I believe. And have to have wives. I know we run into some that say you don't, but I'm convinced you have to have a wife to be an elder or deacon. But an apostle didn't have to have a wife. I don't think a prophet had to have a wife. But if they had a wife, they had to be a believer. Now, I know I go back to Hosea and his wife wasn't faithful. But we're talking about in the New Testament. I would say he's saying that she has to be a believer, a wife that is a believer, a sister, a believer. Any questions? Cephas is Peter, so Peter had a wife here. It's possible in Acts 26:10 that since Paul gave his vote, that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. And my understanding, the Sanhedrin had to be married. And so I would argue then that Paul, if he was a member of the Sanhedrin, that he was married at one time, he's perhaps a widower. Most likely a widower or one scripturally divorced. Okay. I don't think he was one unscripturally divorced. Why? Because he had a right to marry. That's 1 Corinthians 9:5. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I'm not reasoning here. I'm just trying to reason this out. So I would say he's either scripturally divorced or he's a widower if he was part of the Sanhedrin. And if he's never been married, he's a bachelor, so he had a right to marry.
It's past time.
All right. We'll pick up verse 7 next week. Any questions or comments?
No, that's the one we just did.
We'll start with verse 8 next week.